Marcus Hartwell had served the royal family for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed that rainy Tuesday evening in November. As the head of the night security detail at Ravencroft Palace, Marcus prided himself on his discretion and loyalty. The royal family of Valoria had always treated their staff well, and King Edmund VII, though aging and increasingly frail, remained a figure Marcus deeply respected. The palace corridors were dimly lit as Marcus made his routine rounds through the administrative wing. It was well past midnight and the building should have been empty except for essential security personnel. That's why the soft glow emanating from beneath the door of the king's private study immediately caught his attention. King Edmund had been confined to his chambers for weeks, recovering from what the palace physicians described as a severe case of pneumonia that had left him weakened and requiring constant rest. Marcus approached the study door with measured steps, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. The palace had strict protocols about unauthorized access to the king's private offices, especially during his illness. As he drew closer, he could hear the faint scratching of pen on paper and the occasional rustle of documents. Someone was definitely inside, working late into the night. Through the keyhole, Marcus caught a glimpse of a figure seated at the king's massive oak desk. The person was hunched over what appeared to be official documents, their hand moving in deliberate strokes across the papers. But this wasn't King Edmund. The silhouette was too slight, the movements too fluid. As his eyes adjusted to the limited view, Marcus felt his blood run cold. Queen Isabella, the king's second wife and stepmother to Crown Prince Alexander, was seated in the king's chair, carefully signing document after document. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a simple black dress that made her nearly invisible in the darkened room. What struck Marcus most was the methodical nature of her work. This wasn't someone hastily forging signatures, but rather someone who had done this many times before. Marcus watched in stunned silence as Queen Isabella reached for another stack of papers from a leather portfolio beside her. These appeared to be official state documents, bearing the royal seal and requiring the king's personal authorization. Treaties, appointments, financial authorizations, the kind of paperwork that could reshape the kingdom's future with a simple signature. The queen's technique was practiced and precise. She would read each document carefully, sometimes pausing to consult what appeared to be a reference sheet beside her, then sign with confident strokes. Marcus realized with growing horror that she wasn't just randomly scribbling. She was perfectly replicating King Edmund's signature, down to the distinctive flourish he added to the final D in Edmund. As Marcus continued to observe, Queen Isabella completed the stack before her and reached for her mobile phone. She dialed a number and spoke in hushed tones. "The education reforms are approved," she whispered. "Yes, the military appointments too. The king has given his full authorization." Marcus strained to hear more, but her voice was barely audible through the heavy wooden door. The implications began to cascade through Marcus's mind like falling dominoes. For weeks, possibly months, Queen Isabella had been effectively ruling the kingdom from the shadows, while King Edmund lay incapacitated. Every major decision, every policy change, every appointment that had supposedly come from the king during his illness, it had all been Isabella's doing. Marcus remembered the recent controversies that had puzzled him and other palace staff, the sudden dismissal of longtime royal advisors who had questioned some of the king's recent decisions, the appointment of Isabella's personal friends to key government positions, the radical shifts in foreign policy that seemed completely at odds with King Edmund's previous stance. Now it all made terrible sense. As Queen Isabella continued her clandestine work, Marcus noticed something else that made his heart race. On the corner of the desk sat a small recording device, its red light blinking steadily. She was documenting everything, creating evidence of the king's supposed participation in these decisions. If anyone ever questioned the validity of these signatures, she would have audio proof of the king's involvement. The queen's phone rang softly, and she answered immediately. "Prime Minister Blackwood," she said, her voice taking on a tone of authority that Marcus had never heard her use in public. "The infrastructure bill has the king's full support. You may proceed with the announcement tomorrow." She paused, listening to the response. "No, His Majesty is still recovering and won't be making any public appearances, but his commitment to this project is unwavering." Marcus felt sick as he realized the scope of the deception. The Prime Minister, the Cabinet, Parliament itself, they all believed they were following the king's direct orders. Queen Isabella had managed to insert herself into every level of government while maintaining the facade of a dutiful wife caring for her ailing husband. A new thought struck Marcus with chilling clarity. What if King Edmund's condition was worse than anyone realized? What if these weren't just temporary measures during a brief illness, but a permanent arrangement? The official medical bulletins had been vague, mentioning only that the king was resting comfortably and would return to his duties when his physicians cleared him. But Marcus had noticed that no one outside the queen's inner circle had actually seen the king in weeks. Queen Isabella stood up from the desk, gathering the signed documents into neat stacks. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had perfected this routine over time. As she prepared to leave, she paused at a portrait of King Edmund that hung behind the desk. For a moment, her composed mask slipped, and Marcus saw something in her expression that might have been guilt or perhaps satisfaction. The queen reached into her purse and withdrew a small bottle of what appeared to be medication. She examined the label carefully, shook out 2 pills, and placed them back in the bottle. Marcus couldn't make out the details from his limited vantage point, but the deliberate nature of her actions suggested this was part of her routine. As Queen Isabella moved toward the door, Marcus quickly retreated down the corridor, his mind racing with the weight of what he had witnessed. He had stumbled upon what might be the greatest royal scandal in Valoria's history. The question that haunted him as he completed his rounds was simple but terrifying. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? The rest of Marcus's shift passed in a blur of conflicted thoughts and mounting anxiety. Every protocol he had been trained to follow seemed inadequate for this situation. His duty was to protect the royal family, but from what and from whom? If he reported what he had seen, he could destroy the monarchy itself. If he remained silent, he became complicit in what might be treason. As dawn broke over the palace grounds, Marcus found himself standing in the garden where he had often seen King Edmund take his morning walks in healthier times. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, a simple security guard, now held the power to change the course of the kingdom's future. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any burden he had ever carried. The morning staff began to arrive, their cheerful greetings and routine complaints about the weather creating a surreal contrast to the earth-shattering secret Marcus now carried. He watched as Queen Isabella appeared for breakfast, playing her role perfectly as the concerned wife of an ailing monarch. Her performance was flawless. The worried glances toward the king's chambers, the whispered conferences with the physicians, the careful balance of hope and concern in her public statements. But Marcus now saw through the charade. Every gesture, every carefully chosen word, every public appearance was part of an elaborate deception that had fooled an entire nation. As he prepared to end his shift and return home, Marcus realized that his life had fundamentally changed in the space of a single night. He was no longer just a security guard, he had become the keeper of a secret that could reshape history. The question that would haunt his every waking moment from this point forward was not whether to act on what he had discovered, but how to do so without destroying everything and everyone he had sworn to protect. In the growing light of dawn, Marcus understood that he had witnessed the birth of a shadow monarchy, and he alone held the power to expose it or allow it to continue. Little did he know that Queen Isabella had been aware of his presence outside the study door all along, and that his discovery was about to set in motion a chain of events that would threaten not just the monarchy, but his own life as well. The following evening, Marcus returned to work with a heavy heart and a mind full of doubts. Sleep had eluded him throughout the day as he wrestled with the implications of what he had witnessed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Queen Isabella's practiced hand forging the king's signature, her whispered phone conversations that were reshaping national policy, and that chilling moment when she had examined the mysterious medication. His colleague, Sarah Chen, noticed his distracted state immediately. Sarah had been working palace security for nearly a decade and had developed an almost maternal concern for the younger members of their team. "You look terrible, Marcus," she observed as they began their evening briefing. "Everything all right at home?" Marcus forced a smile and mumbled something about not sleeping well. But Sarah's keen eyes missed nothing. She had survived in palace security by reading people as carefully as she read security protocols, and Marcus's behavior was setting off every alarm bell in her experienced mind. As they conducted their initial rounds together, Marcus found himself unconsciously steering them away from the administrative wing. The very thought of passing the king's study made his stomach churn with anxiety. But Sarah, ever observant, noticed his subtle navigation and made a mental note to investigate later. Around 11:30, Marcus was stationed in the main corridor when he heard the familiar click of high heels on marble flooring. Queen Isabella appeared, walking with purpose toward the king's study. She was dressed in the same understated black outfit as the previous night, and she carried the same leather portfolio. But tonight, she wasn't alone. Following several steps behind was a man Marcus recognized as Dr. Padno, Edmund Thornfield, the king's personal physician. Dr. Thornfield had been treating the royal family for over 20 years and was known for his absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty. His presence tonight seemed to legitimize whatever was about to happen, but Marcus felt an inexplicable chill as he watched the two figures disappear into the study. Marcus positioned himself near a decorative alcove that provided a clear view of the study door, while keeping him hidden from casual observation. Within minutes, he heard voices rising in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Dr. Thornfield's voice, usually measured and calm, carried an edge of distress that Marcus had never heard before. "This has gone too far, Isabella." The doctor's voice drifted through the heavy door. "The medication levels you're requesting, they're dangerous. Edmund could suffer permanent neurological damage, or worse." Queen Isabella's response was sharp and commanding. "Thornfield, I am not asking for your medical opinion on matters of state. The king's condition requires careful management, and you will follow my instructions precisely. Your loyalty to this family has never been questioned, and I trust it won't be now." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as the implications of this conversation sank in. The queen wasn't just forging signatures. She was actively drugging the king to maintain his incapacitated state. Dr. Thornfield, whether willingly or under coercion, was complicit in keeping King Edmund sedated and unable to perform his royal duties. "The dosage you're suggesting could kill him, Dr. Samsa," Thornfield pleaded. "I took an oath to do no harm. I can't be party to this any longer." There was a long pause before Queen Isabella spoke again, her voice dropping to a tone that was both silky and threatening. "Doctor, you seem to be forgetting certain irregularities in your past practice. The gambling debts that were mysteriously paid off 3 years ago. The medical records that were altered to protect certain prominent families from scandal. Your cooperation has been generously rewarded, and I trust you remember the consequences of disappointing the crown." Marcus pressed himself deeper into the shadows as he heard Dr. Thornfield's defeated sigh. "How much longer?" the doctor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Until I determine it's no longer necessary," came the Queen's cold reply. "Edmund's signature will continue to appear on documents as required. The kingdom's stability depends on consistent leadership, and I am providing that leadership. History will remember me as the woman who preserved the monarchy during a crisis." The conversation shifted to technical medical details that Marcus couldn't fully understand. But the general thrust was clear. Dr. Thornfield was being instructed to adjust King Edmund's medication regimen to ensure he remained in a controllable state of semi-consciousness. The king wasn't recovering from pneumonia. He was being systematically drugged to prevent him from interfering with his wife's usurpation of power. After nearly an hour, Dr. Bose Thornfield emerged from the study looking haggard and defeated. He walked past Marcus's hiding spot without seeing him, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his moral compromise. Queen Isabella remained in the study, presumably to continue her nightly routine of document signing and policy making. Marcus waited until Dr. Thornfield had disappeared around a corner before making a decision that would change everything. Instead of retreating to safety, he approached the study door and listened more carefully than he had the night before. This time, he could hear Queen Isabella on a phone call that would chill him to the bone. "Prime Minister Blackwood, I need you to understand the delicate nature of our situation," she was saying. "The king's condition may be more prolonged than we initially hoped. We need to begin discussing succession protocols, purely as a precautionary measure, you understand." Marcus's heart raced as he realized she was laying the groundwork for King Edmund's permanent removal from power. Whether through continued incapacitation or something more final, Queen Isabella was positioning herself to rule indefinitely. Crown Prince Alexander is still too young and inexperienced to handle the full weight of the crown, she continued. As Queen Regent, I would naturally provide guidance and stability during this transitional period. I trust I can count on your support in Parliament? The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Queen Isabella systematically building a case for her continued control of the government. She spoke of national security concerns, economic stability, and the need for experienced leadership during uncertain times. Her arguments were compelling and well-rehearsed, suggesting this wasn't a spontaneous power grab, but a carefully orchestrated long-term plan. As Marcus listened, he began to understand the full scope of Queen Isabella's ambitions. This wasn't just about signing documents in the king's absence. This was about permanently altering the line of succession and establishing herself as the true power behind the throne. Crown Prince Alexander, King Edmund's son from his first marriage, was being systematically marginalized in favor of the Queen's vision for the kingdom's future. The phone call ended, and Marcus heard the familiar sounds of document signing resuming. But tonight, he noticed something different. Queen Isabella was humming softly as she worked, a tune he recognized as a lullaby she had once sung at a public charity event for children. The contrast between her tender public persona and the calculating woman he was observing was so stark it made his skin crawl. Around 2 a.m, Queen Isabella gathered her materials and prepared to leave. But instead of heading directly to her chambers, as she had the night before, she took a detour that led her past Marcus's hiding place. For a terrifying moment, he thought she had spotted him, but she continued walking without pause. However, as she passed, she spoke in a voice just loud enough for him to hear. "The palace has such excellent security, doesn't it? I always feel so safe knowing that our guards are watching over everything so carefully." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. She knew. Somehow Queen Isabella was aware that he had been observing her activities, and she was sending him a message. The question was whether this was a warning or a threat, and Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. As Queen Isabella disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, Marcus realized that his position had fundamentally changed. He was no longer a secret observer. He had become a potential threat that needed to be managed. The Queen's casual comment suggested that she was confident in her ability to handle any complications he might present. The remainder of Marcus's shift passed in a state of paranoid anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. Every unexpected noise made him jump. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering if Queen Isabella had already taken steps to ensure his silence. As dawn approached and the palace began to stir with the activity of the day shift, Marcus made a decision that would set the next phase of this deadly game into motion. He couldn't remain silent any longer, but he also couldn't risk exposing what he knew without protection. He needed allies, evidence, and a plan. The first person he thought of was Sarah Chen. Her experience and connections within the palace staff might provide the support he needed. But approaching her would mean expanding the circle of people who knew the truth, and Marcus wasn't sure he had the right to burden anyone else with this dangerous knowledge. As he walked home through the early morning mist, Marcus felt the weight of the secret pressing down on him like a physical force. Queen Isabella had built her shadow monarchy through careful manipulation, strategic blackmail, and systematic drugging of the rightful king. She had corrupted a respected physician, deceived the government, and fooled an entire nation. But she had made one critical error. She had underestimated the conscience of a simple security guard who refused to remain silent in the face of treason. The question now was whether Marcus could expose her crimes before she found a way to silence him permanently. The game of cat and mouse had begun, and Marcus was no longer sure who was the hunter and who was the prey. Sarah Chen had been expecting Marcus to approach her ever since she noticed his strange behavior 2 nights earlier. When he appeared at her apartment door the following morning, looking haggard and desperate, she wasn't surprised. What did surprise her was the incredible story he proceeded to tell. Sarah listened in growing amazement as Marcus detailed everything he had witnessed. Queen Isabella's midnight document signing sessions, her manipulation of Dr. Thornfield, the systematic drugging of King Edmund, and her plans to permanently remove the rightful monarch from power. Any other person might have dismissed such claims as the paranoid fantasies of an overworked security guard, but Sarah had her own suspicions about the Queen's recent behavior. "I've been wondering about some things myself," Sarah admitted after Marcus finished his account. 3 weeks ago, I was assigned to escort Dr. Thornfield to the king's chambers for what was supposed to be a routine medical check, but instead of the normal 15-minute visit, he was in there for over 2 hours. When he came out, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sarah poured them both coffee and continued her story. The next day, I overheard a conversation between two of the Queen's personal assistants. They were discussing medication schedules and dosage adjustments, which seemed odd since they have no medical training. When they noticed me listening, they immediately changed the subject to something about floral arrangements. Marcus felt a surge of relief at having someone believe his story, but Sarah's next words brought him back to the gravity of their situation. Marcus, do you understand what we're talking about here? This isn't just palace intrigue or political maneuvering. If what you've seen is true, Queen Isabella is committing high treason. The penalty for that is life imprisonment, or worse. They spent the next hour developing a plan. Sarah's years of experience in palace security had taught her the importance of documentation and evidence. We need proof, she insisted. Your word against the Queen's won't be enough, especially given her current influence over the government. We need photographs, recordings, something that can't be dismissed or explained away. Sarah revealed that she had access to the palace's security system, including cameras and recording equipment that could be discreetly deployed. The challenge, she explained, is getting the evidence without alerting the Queen or her allies to what we're doing. If she realizes we're onto her, she could accelerate her timeline or, worse, eliminate the witnesses. That evening, Sarah accompanied Marcus on his rounds, officially as part of a routine security protocol review. She had secreted a small, high-resolution camera and recording device in her equipment, planning to document Queen Isabella's activities from multiple angles. As they approached the administrative wing around midnight, they were both tense with anticipation, but Queen Isabella didn't appear at her usual time. 11:30 passed, then midnight, then 12:30. Marcus began to worry that his discovery had somehow altered her routine, or that she had become suspicious of the increased security presence. Then, at nearly 1 in the morning, they heard the distinct sound of her heels on the marble floor. Tonight, however, Queen Isabella wasn't alone. Accompanying her were 2 men Marcus didn't recognize, well-dressed individuals who moved with the practiced alertness of professional security personnel. These weren't palace guards. They were private contractors, the kind of people who specialized in handling sensitive situations with absolute discretion. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him deeper into the shadows. Private security, she whispered. The Queen is taking precautions. They watched as the group entered the study and immediately heard the sounds of a much more substantial operation than the solitary document signing Marcus had previously observed. From their concealed position, they could hear multiple voices engaged in what sounded like a high-level strategy meeting. Queen Isabella's voice was dominant, but the men were clearly providing input and asking detailed questions about logistics, timelines, and contingency plans. The prince is becoming more insistent about seeing his father, one of the men reported. He's been asking uncomfortable questions about the king's treatment and demanding access to medical records. We may need to consider alternative approaches to managing his concerns. Queen Isabella's response chilled both eavesdroppers to the bone. Crown Prince Alexander has always been impulsive and emotional. Perhaps it's time he learned that asking too many questions can be dangerous. Dr. Thornfield has mentioned that depression often runs in royal families. A tragic accident or a sudden onset of mental illness wouldn't be entirely unexpected. Marcus felt Sarah's grip on his arm tighten as they both realized they were listening to a conspiracy that extended far beyond document forgery. Queen Isabella was discussing the elimination of anyone who threatened her hold on power, including the king's own son and heir to the throne. The conversation continued with disturbing specificity. The men discussed various scenarios for removing Crown Prince Alexander from the line of succession, ranging from manufactured scandals that would force his abdication to more permanent solutions that would eliminate him as a threat entirely. Queen Isabella listened to each proposal with the detached interest of someone reviewing a business plan. The international situation provides excellent cover, she noted. Border tensions with our neighbors, economic uncertainty, the threat of terrorism, all of these create an environment where tragic accidents and sudden disappearances can be attributed to external forces rather than internal politics. As they listened, Sarah carefully positioned her recording device to capture as much of the conversation as possible. The evidence they were gathering would be devastating if they could get it to the right people, but the challenge was determining who could be trusted with such explosive information. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours, covering everything from media management to international relations to domestic policy initiatives that would cement Queen Isabella's control over the kingdom. It became clear that her ambitions extended far beyond serving as a temporary regent during King Edmund's illness. She was planning a complete transformation of the monarchy, with herself as the central figure in a new constitutional arrangement. Parliament will need to be managed carefully, one of the men advised. Some members are already asking questions about the king's prolonged absence from public functions. We should consider early elections that might produce a more cooperative legislative body. Queen Isabella laughed, a sound that conveyed both confidence and cruelty. Prime Minister Blackwood is proving quite amenable to guidance. I suspect that a few well-placed suggestions about the national interest will ensure parliamentary cooperation. Those who prove resistant can be reminded that their own past indiscretions might not remain private indefinitely. Marcus realized with growing horror that Queen Isabella had been systematically gathering compromising information on key political figures, building a network of controlled allies who were essentially being blackmailed into compliance. Her shadow monarchy was supported by a web of corruption and intimidation that reached into every level of government. As the meeting began to wind down, the men started discussing immediate action items and deadlines. Crown Prince Alexander was to be managed within the next 2 weeks, preferably in a way that would generate public sympathy rather than suspicion. Thornfield would be given new instructions for adjusting King Edmund's medication to ensure he remained incapacitated but stable. And several key parliamentary figures would receive visits from concerned citizens who happened to know about their personal vulnerabilities. Remember, Queen Isabella concluded, the kingdom's stability depends on strong leadership during uncertain times. History will remember us as the people who preserved the monarchy when it was threatened by weakness and indecision. Whatever measures we take are justified by that higher purpose. As the group prepared to leave, Sarah quickly gathered her recording equipment and motioned for Marcus to retreat further into the shadows. They waited until the corridor was completely clear before making their way back to a secure area of the palace where they could discuss what they had learned. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah whispered as they reviewed the recordings she had captured. "Queen Isabella isn't just committing treason. She's orchestrating a complete coup d'etat, and she's planning to murder the crown prince to eliminate any threats to her power." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had discovered. Who can we trust with this information? If she has dirt on parliamentary leaders and has corrupted the prime minister, who's left? Sarah was quiet for a long moment before responding. "There is someone, but approaching him will be extremely dangerous. General Morrison, the head of the Royal Guard, has always been absolutely loyal to King Edmund personally. If anyone would be willing to act on evidence of treason against the king, it would be him." They agreed to approach General Morrison the following day, but as they made their plans, neither Marcus nor Sarah realized that Queen Isabella's private security team had been conducting their own surveillance. Hidden cameras had captured their presence near the study, and sophisticated listening devices had recorded enough of their whispered conversations to identify them as potential threats. As Marcus finally headed home in the early morning hours, he was unaware that his apartment was already under surveillance. Queen Isabella's shadow monarchy was about to demonstrate just how ruthlessly it dealt with those who threatened its existence. The next phase of the deadly game was about to begin, and the stakes had just become a matter of life and death for everyone involved. Marcus and Sarah had the evidence they needed to expose the conspiracy, but getting that evidence to someone who could act on it would prove to be the most dangerous challenge of their lives. Queen Isabella had not built her shadow empire by being careless with threats, and she was about to show exactly how far she was willing to go to protect her hold on power. General Morrison had served the crown for 37 years, rising through the ranks of the Royal Guard through unwavering loyalty and tactical brilliance. When Sarah Chen approached him with a request for a private meeting, citing urgent matters of royal security, he agreed despite the unusual nature of the request. What he didn't expect was the bombshell revelation that would shake the very foundations of everything he believed about his service to the monarchy. The meeting took place in General Morrison's private office, a spartanly decorated room lined with military commendations and photographs, documenting his decades of service. Sarah had insisted that Marcus accompany her, reasoning that the general would need to hear the account directly from the primary witness. Both guards were nervous but determined as they presented their evidence to the man who commanded the king's personal protection force. General Morrison listened in stunned silence as Marcus recounted his observations, his weathered face growing increasingly grave as the story unfolded. When Sarah played the audio recordings from Queen Isabella's strategy meeting, the general's hands clenched into fists, and his jaw tightened with barely controlled rage. "Sweet Mother of God," he breathed when they finished their presentation. "30 years I've been protecting this family and I never suspected." He stood and paced behind his desk, his military bearing intact despite the emotional turmoil. "The implications of what you're telling me, if this is true, it's not just treason. It's the complete destruction of everything the monarchy represents." Sarah leaned forward urgently. "General, we need to act quickly. The recordings indicate that Crown Prince Alexander is in immediate danger. Queen Isabella's people are planning to eliminate him within 2 weeks, and they're discussing making it look like an accident or suicide." General Morrison stopped pacing and fixed them with an intense stare. "You understand that what you're asking me to do could start a civil war? If I move against the Queen without absolute proof, and I'm wrong, it will destroy the monarchy anyway. But if I don't act, and you're right," he trailed off, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "There's something else," Marcus added hesitantly. "I think they know we're onto them. Queen Isabella made a comment the other night that suggested she was aware of my observations. We may not have much time before they try to silence us." As if summoned by his words, General Morrison's aide appeared at the door with an urgent message. "Sir, there's been an incident. Marcus Hartwell's apartment building has suffered a gas explosion. The fire department is on scene, but there appear to be casualties." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. "My neighbors," he whispered. "Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman next door, the family with the young children upstairs." General Morrison's expression hardened with resolve. "That's not a coincidence. They're sending a message and eliminating evidence at the same time." He turned to his aide. "Cancel all my appointments and secure this building. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization." To Marcus and Sarah, he said, "You're both under my protection now. We're going to end this, but we need to be smarter than they are." The next several hours were a whirlwind of careful planning and strategic preparation. General Morrison used his authority to conduct a routine security review that allowed him to position loyal Royal Guard members in key locations throughout the palace. He also initiated discreet inquiries into Queen Isabella's recent activities, using his network of trusted officers to gather additional evidence. What they discovered was even more disturbing than they had imagined. Queen Isabella's corruption extended deep into the royal household staff, with several key positions filled by people whose loyalty had been purchased through bribes, blackmail, or threats. The palace that Marcus and Sarah thought they knew had been transformed into a nest of treachery and deceit. "She's been planning this for years," General Morrison reported as they reviewed the intelligence his officers had gathered. The marriage to King Edmund wasn't just about becoming queen. It was about positioning herself to seize power when the opportunity presented itself. The king's illness didn't create this situation. It was the trigger for a plan that was already in place. Meanwhile, Crown Prince Alexander had been growing increasingly suspicious of his stepmother's behavior. At 28, he was intelligent, educated, and possessed the kind of natural leadership qualities that made him genuinely popular with both the public and the military. His attempts to see his father had been consistently blocked by Queen Isabella's staff, who cited medical concerns and the king's need for rest. "I'm going to see my father today," Prince Alexander announced to his personal security detail that afternoon. "I don't care what the Queen's physicians say. I want to see him with my own eyes and hear from him directly about his condition." General Morrison received word of the prince's intentions and realized that this could be the moment of truth. If Prince Alexander discovered the extent of his father's condition, it would either expose Queen Isabella's deception or result in the prince's elimination. Either way, the crisis was about to reach its climax. "We need to get to the prince before Isabella's people do," Morrison decided. If he walks into that room without knowing what's really happening, he could be walking into a death trap. Sarah volunteered for the dangerous mission of intercepting Prince Alexander before he reached the king's chambers. Using her security clearance and knowledge of the palace layout, she managed to intercept the prince in a corridor that was temporarily clear of Queen Isabella's surveillance. Your Highness, please forgive the interruption, but there's something you need to know before you see your father, she said urgently. Prince Alexander's initial irritation at being stopped by a security guard quickly turned to concern as Sarah explained that his life was in immediate danger. What you're telling me is impossible, Prince Alexander protested. Isabella may not be my favorite person, but she's not a murderer. And Dr. Thornfield has been treating our family for decades. Sarah quickly played portions of the recorded conversation that specifically mentioned threats to the prince's safety. As he listened to Queen Isabella's voice discussing his elimination with cold calculation, Prince Alexander's face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, shock, anger, and finally, grim determination. "Where is General Morrison?" he demanded. "I want to hear everything, and I want to see all the evidence." While Sarah was briefing Prince Alexander, Marcus had been tasked with conducting surveillance of Queen Isabella's movements. What he discovered filled him with dread. The Queen was preparing for what appeared to be a final confrontation. She had summoned her private security team, Dr. Thornfield, and several other key conspirators to an emergency meeting. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe the gathering and was horrified to hear them discussing the acceleration of their timeline. Prince Alexander's insistence on seeing his father had forced their hand, and they were now planning to implement their most extreme options immediately. "The prince's demands have become untenable," Queen Isabella declared. "Dr. Thornfield, you will prepare a final dose of medication for the king. His suffering has gone on long enough, and it would be a mercy to allow him to pass peacefully in his sleep." The doctor's voice trembled as he protested. "Your Majesty, I will not commit murder no matter what leverage you have over me." Queen Isabella's response was delivered with chilling calm. "Doctor, you seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter. Your granddaughter attends St. Mary's Academy, does she not? Such a lovely school, though their security measures are rather lax. It would be tragic if something were to happen to such a bright young girl." Dr. Thornfield's anguished gasp was audible even from Marcus's hiding place. The Queen had just threatened the life of an innocent child to force compliance with regicide. The Shadow Monarchy had revealed its true nature. It was willing to murder anyone, including children, to maintain power. You have 1 hour to prepare the injection. Queen Isabella continued. The king will pass quietly in his sleep, a victim of his prolonged illness. Crown Prince Alexander will be informed that his father's condition deteriorated rapidly and that he died despite our best medical efforts. The prince's grief will make him vulnerable to guidance from his caring stepmother during this difficult transition. Marcus realized with growing horror that they weren't just planning to murder King Edmund. They intended to use his death to manipulate Prince Alexander into accepting Queen Isabella's continued control. The prince, grieving and overwhelmed by sudden royal responsibilities, would be easy prey for the Queen's psychological manipulation. As the meeting dispersed, Marcus used his radio to alert General Morrison and Sarah about the immediate threat to the king's life. "They're moving tonight," he reported. "Dr. Thornfield has been ordered to prepare a lethal injection, and they're threatening his granddaughter to ensure compliance." General Morrison's voice crackled back over the radio with military precision. "All units, this is Code Black. Repeat, Code Black. Secure all access points to the royal chambers immediately. No one approaches the king without my direct authorization." The final battle for the throne of Valoria was about to begin, and it would be fought not on a distant battlefield, but in the corridors and chambers of Ravencroft Palace itself. Queen Isabella had built her shadow monarchy through deception, corruption, and murder, but she had underestimated the loyalty and courage of those sworn to protect the true king. As night fell over the palace, Marcus, Sarah, General Morrison, and Crown Prince Alexander prepared to confront the forces that had been slowly destroying the monarchy from within. The outcome would determine not just who ruled the kingdom, but whether the institution of the monarchy would survive at all. The Shadow Monarch was about to discover that some shadows cannot withstand the light of truth. no matter how carefully they have been cultivated. The confrontation came at midnight, in the very chambers where King Edmund lay in his drug-induced stupor, unaware that the fate of his kingdom was being decided around his bedside. General Morrison had positioned his most trusted officers throughout the royal wing, while Queen Isabella's private security team had taken strategic positions of their own. The palace had become a battleground where the future of the monarchy would be determined. Doctor, this is the book. It's about history. Thornfield arrived at the king's chambers carrying a medical bag that contained both the lethal injection Queen Isabella had demanded and the antidotes that might reverse months of systematic poisoning. His hands shook as he approached the door, knowing that his next actions would either save or damn not just the king, but his own granddaughter as well. Crown Prince Alexander, accompanied by Sarah and two of Morrison's officers, intercepted the doctor before he could enter the royal chambers. Dr. Thornfield, the prince said quietly, we know everything. We know what she's been forcing you to do, and we know about the threats to your family. You don't have to go through with this. The elderly physician looked at Prince Alexander with eyes full of anguish and shame. Your Highness, they have my granddaughter. If I don't do this, they'll kill her. I've already compromised everything I've ever believed in. I can't let an innocent child pay for my failures. Sarah stepped forward with urgent news. Doctor, General Morrison has already dispatched a team to secure your granddaughter. She's safe now, along with the rest of your family. You're free to do what's right. Relief flooded Dr. Thornfield's face as he realized he was no longer trapped between impossible choices. Then let me help you save him, he said, his voice regaining strength. I know exactly what she's been giving him and how to counteract it. With proper treatment, King Edmund could be conscious and coherent within hours. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella had realized that her carefully constructed plans were unraveling. Her private security team reported that they were being systematically outmaneuvered by General Morrison's forces, and several key members of her conspiracy had been taken into custody. The shadow monarchy that had taken years to build was collapsing in a matter of hours. This is not over, she declared to her remaining allies as they gathered in her private chambers. I have contingencies that none of them know about. If I cannot rule this kingdom, then I will ensure that no one can. Her final gambit was as desperate as it was dangerous. Queen Isabella had been secretly siphoning funds from the royal treasury to finance international mercenaries and foreign agents who could destabilize the kingdom if her coup failed. Rather than face justice for her crimes, she was prepared to plunge Valoria into chaos and potentially civil war. Activate the external assets, she ordered her communication specialist. Tell them to begin operations immediately. Target the power grid, communication networks, and transportation infrastructure. If the palace wants to play games with legitimacy, let's see how they handle a national emergency. But Queen Isabella had made one critical error in her desperation. She had underestimated the loyalty and competence of the very institution she had been trying to subvert. General Morrison's intelligence network had been tracking her external connections for weeks, ever since Marcus first brought his suspicions to light. Madam, your external assets have been compromised, one of Morrison's officers announced as he entered her chambers with a full security detail. Foreign intelligence services have been very cooperative in helping us understand the scope of your treachery. Your mercenaries are currently in the custody of international law enforcement. Queen Isabella's mask of regal composure finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating criminal beneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with, she snarled. I am the Queen of Valoria. I have diplomatic immunity and international recognition. You cannot touch me. Crown Prince Alexander appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding and authoritative in a way that reminded everyone present of his royal lineage. Isabella, he said with quiet steel in his voice, you ceased to be Queen of Valoria the moment you committed treason against the crown. You are now simply a criminal who will face justice for her crimes. The final confrontation was surprisingly anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence of her guilt and the collapse of all her support systems, Queen Isabella's resistance crumbled. Her private security team surrendered without violence, recognizing that their employer's cause was lost. The shadow monarchy that had terrorized the kingdom for months disappeared like morning mist under the light of truth. In King Edmund's chambers, Dr. Thornfield worked frantically to reverse the effects of months of systematic drugging. The neural pathways should begin clearing within 6 hours, he explained to Prince Alexander as he administered a series of counteracting medications. Your father's mind is intact, but it will take time for the fog to lift completely. Marcus stood guard outside the king's chambers, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 days earlier, he had been a simple security guard whose biggest concern was completing his nightly rounds without incident. Now he had helped expose and defeat a conspiracy that threatened the very existence of the monarchy he had sworn to protect. Sarah joined him in the corridor, looking exhausted but satisfied. Hard to believe it's over, she said quietly. When you first came to me with this story, I thought you might be losing your mind. Now I realize you probably saved the kingdom. We all did, Marcus replied. This wasn't something any one person could have handled alone. It took all of us working together to bring her down. As dawn broke over Ravencroft Palace, King Edmund stirred in his bed for the first time in months without the haze of forced medication clouding his thoughts. His first words were weak but clear. Alexander? Is that you, son? Prince Alexander grasped his father's hand, tears streaming down his face. Yes. Father, I'm here. You're safe now. We're all safe. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Queen Isabella's conspiracy. Bank records showed massive financial irregularities, with royal funds being diverted to private accounts and used to purchase silence and cooperation. Communication records documented a network of corruption that reached into Parliament, the military, and international criminal organizations. Thornfield, granted immunity in exchange for his full cooperation, provided detailed testimony about the medical aspects of the conspiracy. She was brilliant in her evil, he admitted during his deposition. The drug regimen she forced me to maintain would have eventually caused permanent brain damage, making the king's incapacitation irreversible. She was planning to murder him slowly while maintaining plausible medical cover. The trials that followed dominated international news for months. Queen Isabella, stripped of her royal titles and diplomatic protections, faced charges of high treason, attempted regicide, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and numerous other crimes. Her defense attorneys' attempts to portray her as a misguided woman trying to protect the kingdom were thoroughly demolished by the overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Prime Minister Blackwood and several other government officials were forced to resign in disgrace when their cooperation with the conspiracy was revealed. Early elections were called, resulting in a landslide victory for parties committed to governmental transparency and constitutional reform. Marcus and Sarah were both promoted and decorated for their crucial role in exposing the conspiracy. General Morrison retired with full honors, his final act of service being perhaps his most important. Dr. Thornfield, though professionally censured, was allowed to continue practicing medicine under supervision, his cooperation in saving the king's life weighing heavily in his favor. King Edmund, his health gradually improving as the effects of forced medication wore off, addressed the nation 6 months after his liberation. The monarchy has faced its greatest test since its founding, he declared in a speech that was broadcast worldwide. We have learned that the greatest threats to our institutions come not from external enemies but from corruption within. We have also learned that the true strength of our democracy lies not in the power of the crown, but in the courage of ordinary citizens who refuse to remain silent when they witness injustice. Crown Prince Alexander, now heir apparent with his father's health restored, implemented sweeping reforms to prevent future corruption within the royal household. New oversight mechanisms, regular medical examinations by independent physicians, and enhanced security protocols were established to ensure that no individual could again accumulate the kind of unchecked power that Queen Isabella had wielded. The international implications of the conspiracy were far-reaching. Several countries launched investigations into their own government officials who had been in contact with Queen Isabella's network. Intelligence agencies shared information that led to the exposure of similar corruption schemes in other nations, triggering what some historians would later call the Valoria effect, a wave of transparency and accountability measures that swept across the world. Queen Isabella herself received a life sentence without possibility of parole, to be served in a maximum security prison far from the palace where she had once held such influence. Her final statement to the court revealed no remorse for her actions. I regret only that I failed. History will vindicate my methods, if not my results. Marcus returned to his duties as a palace security guard, but his perspective on the job had fundamentally changed. No longer was he simply protecting buildings and maintaining routines. He understood himself to be a guardian of democracy itself, someone whose vigilance stood between legitimate government and the forces that would corrupt it. On quiet nights, as he made his rounds through the corridors of Ravencroft Palace, Marcus sometimes paused at the door of what had once been Queen Isabella's study. The room had been completely renovated, stripped of all traces of the shadow monarchy that had operated there. But Marcus would never forget the lessons he had learned in those dark hours when he first witnessed evil masquerading as authority. The kingdom of Valoria had survived its greatest constitutional crisis, but the price of that survival was eternal vigilance. Marcus, Sarah, General Morrison, and all who had participated in exposing the conspiracy understood that democracy was not a system that could be taken for granted. It required the active participation and moral courage of ordinary citizens who were willing to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. The shadow monarch had been defeated, but the shadows themselves remained, waiting for the next opportunity to corrupt those who wielded power in the name of others. The victory was complete, but it was also temporary. A reminder that the price of freedom is indeed eternal vigilance, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by armies, but by individuals who refuse to look the other way when confronted with corruption and injustice. In the end, the true monarch was not the person who wore the crown, but the system of laws and principles that ensured the crown would always serve the people, rather than the other way around. And that system would endure only as long as there were people like Marcus Hartwell willing to stand guard in the darkness, watching for the shadows that would consume the light of democracy if given the chance.